My name is Margaret. For 64 years, I believed that love meant showing up without conditions, without demands, without keeping score. I believed that if you gave enough, sacrificed enough, stayed quiet enough, the people you loved would eventually see your worth. I was wrong, and it took walking through my son's front door on a Tuesday afternoon to finally understand that some people will never see your worth. They will only see what else they can take from you. I need to tell you what happened, from the beginning, so you understand why I did what I did. Because when people heard the story, some called me cruel, some said I went too far, but not one of them, not a single one, was there that Tuesday. Not one of them heard what I heard, and not one of them looked into my granddaughter's eyes afterward and saw what I saw. So let me start at the beginning. I retired from nursing 3 years ago, after 31 years at Riverside Memorial. My husband, Gerald, passed 8 years before that, a heart attack on a Saturday morning while he was making pancakes. Just like that. 1 minute he was standing at the stove, and the next minute he was gone. And I was alone in a house that suddenly felt like it was made of cardboard. My son Daniel was 26 then, already out of the house, already building his own life. He came back for the funeral, stayed 2 weeks, and then left again. I didn't blame him. That was what we raised him to do, to be independent, to build something of his own. What Gerald and I built together was modest but real. A 3-bedroom house paid off completely, savings that Gerald had been careful with his whole life, and a small commercial property on Linwood Avenue that Gerald had bought in 1998, almost on a whim, because a dentist's office was moving out and the price was low. For years, we rented it to a dry cleaner, then a tax office, then it sat empty for almost 2 years. When Daniel came to me 6 years ago with his dream of opening a restaurant, I handed him the keys to that building and told him it was his. No rent, his name on the lease. My gift to him, the way parents give gifts when they have something to give. I also co-signed his small business loan, $48,000, because the bank wanted a guarantor and Daniel's credit history was thin. I signed my name without hesitation because he was my son and I trusted him, and I had worked 31 years in hospitals watching people die with regrets, and I did not want money to be one of mine. The restaurant did well. Daniel had always been a good cook, and he had Gerald's charm, that easy way of making people feel welcome. He called it Ember. It was a nice name. Warm. I went every Sunday for the first 2 years, sat at the corner table by the window, ordered the roasted chicken, and watched my son move through the dining room like he owned the whole world, which in that small way, he did. Then he met Renee. She came in as a customer one February evening and apparently stayed until closing. Daniel called me the next morning, which was unusual enough that I sat down before I answered. He sounded like a teenager. He said she was beautiful, she was funny, she had a son named Connor from a previous relationship, and he had asked for her number and she had given it to him. I said I was happy for him. I meant it. I met Renee 6 weeks later at the restaurant. She was attractive, yes, and she had an easy laugh, and she touched Daniel's arm constantly, the way some women do when they're staking a claim. I noticed it, but I said nothing. She was polite to me, asked questions about nursing, said her aunt had been a nurse, and it was the hardest job in the world. I liked her well enough. What I noticed, and what I stored quietly in the back of my mind without examining too closely, was how she spoke about her son, Connor. She mentioned him often, praised him often, his soccer, his grades, his cleverness. And when I asked whether Connor and Daniel were getting along, she smiled and said Connor was the most important thing in her life, that any man who wanted to be with her had to understand that first. I thought, that's a reasonable thing for a mother to say. I did not think about what it meant for anyone else. Daniel and Renee married 14 months after they met. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, at a venue outside the city. I wore the blue dress I had bought for my niece's wedding, and I danced with my son, and I cried the happy kind of tears. Renee's mother was there, a thin, quiet woman who looked like she was waiting for the evening to end. I didn't pay much attention to her at the time. Later, I would think about her more. 8 months after the wedding, Daniel called me on a Sunday morning, my morning at Ember, and told me that Renee was pregnant. He sounded genuinely happy. I was genuinely happy. I told him Gerald would have been so proud, and I heard Daniel go quiet for a moment the way he always did when his father came up in conversation. Sophie was born the following spring. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and Gerald's nose. I saw it immediately, that small, upturned nose, and I sat in the hospital room holding her and thinking that grief is strange, how it can sit inside you for years like a stone and then suddenly shift, become something softer, something that doesn't hurt the same way. I was at Ember less often after Sophie was born, because I was at Daniel's house more. I helped with the baby on weekday mornings while Renee slept in. I learned Sophie's preferences, the way she only fell back asleep if you patted her back instead of rocking her, the one stuffed rabbit she needed in her crib, the particular pitch of cry that meant gas versus tired versus hungry. I learned my granddaughter the way I had learned patience in the ICU, with attention and patience, and the understanding that every person, even a 7-pound one, has a logic to them if you pay close enough attention. For the first 2 years, things were manageable. Renee was not warm with me, but she was civil. She had opinions about how Sophie should be raised that sometimes conflicted with mine, and she would express them with a smile that was really not a smile at all. I learned to back away when I saw that smile. I learned to agree, and then do what I thought was right when she wasn't in the room. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was a functioning one. Connor was 10 when Sophie was born. He was a quiet boy, watchful, with his mother's calculating quality hidden behind a polite surface. He did not dislike Sophie, exactly. He simply did not register her as a person of consequence. When she cried, he left the room. When she reached for him, he moved away. He treated her the way some children treat furniture objects in the space, neither loved nor hated. What I did not understand until much later was that he was learning from his mother. I started noticing the imbalance when Sophie turned 5. Connor was 13 by then and had become a central organizing principle of the household. His soccer schedule dictated family weekends. His school events took priority. Renee cooked his preferred meals, heavy pasta dishes, specific snacks he liked, and when Sophie asked for something different, the answer was almost always no. Not unkind. Exactly. Just no. Connor's preference was the preference that mattered. Daniel didn't seem to notice. Or if he noticed, he had decided not to say anything. I wondered sometimes if Renee's grip on my son was about love or about something closer to management. The way she organized the household, the decisions, the priorities, all of it flowing through her in ways that left Daniel grateful and compliant. I brought it up once, gently, when Daniel came alone to Ember to go over some paperwork with me. I said I had noticed that Sophie seemed to spend a lot of time on her own at home. He said Renee was a wonderful mother and that I needed to trust the family they were building. He said it with a patience that was also a warning. I dropped it. What I could not drop was Sophie herself. I saw her every Tuesday. I had established Tuesdays as my day with her when she was an infant, and no one had ever taken that away from me. I would pick her up at 9 in the morning, and we would spend the day together. The park in good weather, the library when it rained, lunch at a diner where they knew us, and always brought Sophie the kids' menu with crayons. She was a bright, verbal child, imaginative, with a habit of narrating her own play in a quiet undertone that I found completely enchanting. She was also, I had begun to understand, lonely. She talked about Connor's room, which had a television and a gaming console and shelves of things that were his and that she was not allowed to touch. She talked about the way dinner was always Connor's favorite and how she didn't like pasta very much, but she ate it anyway, because if she said anything, her mother, she called Renee her mother, which is what Daniel had asked her to call her. Her mother would get a certain look on her face. I asked Sophie to describe the look. Sophie was 7 by then. She said, like I'm being annoying on purpose. I sat with that for a long time after I dropped her home that evening. The Tuesday that changed everything was in October, 8 months ago. Sophie had just turned 8 the week before. I had taken her to the movies for her birthday, just the 2 of us, and she had held my hand during the previews and fallen asleep against my shoulder for the last 20 minutes of the film, and I had not moved, not once, just sat in the dark theater with my granddaughter breathing softly against me and thought that this was one of the best things in my life. I arrived at Daniel's house at 9 that Tuesday morning. I had my key. They had given me a key years ago for emergencies, and I had never had occasion to use it, but I always had it. I rang the doorbell first, as I always did. No answer. I could hear the television through the door, loudly, a gaming sound that meant Connor. I rang again. Nothing. I used my key. The living room was empty except for Connor, 14 years old, sprawled on the couch with a controller in his hand and his shoes still on, and on the coffee table a half-eaten bowl of cereal and 2 empty juice boxes. He glanced at me when I came in and looked back at the screen without a word. I said, "Good morning, Connor. Where is Sophie?" He said, without looking up. "Cleaning." I said, "Cleaning what?" He shrugged. He was already back in his game. I walked down the hallway toward the bedrooms. What I heard stopped me before I reached the bathroom door. It was Renee's voice, and it was not quiet. She was saying, "This is disgusting. Do you understand me? Do you see this? Look at the grout. Look at it. Did you scrub it, or did you just wave a sponge around? Do it again. Do the whole thing again, and do it right this time." I pushed the door open. Sophie was on her knees on the bathroom floor. She was wearing the pink pajamas I had bought her for her birthday, the ones with the little stars on them, and she had a scrub brush in her right hand and a bucket of cleaning water beside her knee. The bathroom smelled of bleach strong enough to make my eyes water. My granddaughter looked up at me, and her face did the thing that broke something open in my chest. She did not look surprised that her grandmother had found her like this. She looked relieved, and then, almost immediately, afraid. Renee turned around. She was wearing exercise clothes, a coffee cup in her hand, fully dressed for a morning of leisure, while her 8-year-old stepchild scrubbed the bathroom floor. She said, "Oh, Margaret, I didn't know you were coming today." I said, "Tuesdays. I always come on Tuesdays." She said, "Sophie was just learning some responsibility. It's good for children to have chores." I looked at Sophie on her knees, on the tile floor in her birthday pajamas at 9 in the morning, with her hands red from bleach water. I looked at the coffee cup in Renee's hand. I looked at the sounds coming from the living room where Connor was playing video games. I said, "Get up, sweetheart. Put the brush down." Renee said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Sophie, come here." Sophie stood up. She set the brush in the bucket very carefully, the way children do when they are trying not to cause any additional trouble. And she walked to me, and I took her hand, and I led her out of the bathroom. Renee followed us into the hallway saying my name, saying I was overreacting, saying this was her house and her child and her rules. And I kept walking. I took Sophie to the kitchen. I helped her wash her hands at the sink. Her palms were chapped. I could feel it, and I said quietly, "Does this happen a lot?" Sophie looked at the kitchen doorway to see if Renee was there. She wasn't. Not yet. Sophie looked back at me and nodded once, a small, serious nod. I said, "On days that I'm not here?" She nodded again. I said, "What else?" She said, very quietly. "Mostly the bathrooms, and sometimes the kitchen floor. Connor's not supposed to know. He doesn't have to do things like that. Mom says it builds character for me, but Connor already has good character." I put my hands on either side of my granddaughter's face. I said, "You have the best character of anyone I know." Then I called Daniel. He didn't answer. He was at Ember preparing for the lunch service. I left a message that said, "I am taking Sophie for the day. Call me back as soon as you get this. It is important." Renee had positioned herself in the living room, her voice controlled now, almost pleasant, the way it got when she understood that she had miscalculated something. She said she hoped I wasn't going to make a big deal of this. She said all children had household responsibilities. She said Connor had responsibilities too. I just hadn't seen them. I said, "What are Connor's responsibilities?" She listed them. Taking out the trash on Thursdays, keeping his room tidy, occasionally unloading the dishwasher. I said, "And Sophie is responsible for scrubbing bathrooms with bleach products before 9 in the morning in her pajamas." Renee said, "I am not going to justify my parenting to you." I took my granddaughter's hand and I walked out the front door. In the car, Sophie sat in the back seat and I watched her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window. After about 2 minutes, she said, "Grandma, are you going to tell Daddy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Will he be upset?" I said, "At the right person?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Renee says I complain too much, and that's why Daddy is always tired. I had to keep my hands steady on the steering wheel." I said, "Your daddy's tiredness has nothing to do with you. Do you hear me? Not one single thing." She put her cheek against the window glass. She said, "Okay." Daniel called me back at 11:30. I told him clearly and calmly what I had seen. There was a long silence. Then he said he was sure it was an isolated thing. He said Renee was a good mother, that Renee loved Sophie. He said the word love the way people sometimes do when they mean, please don't make me look at this. I said, Daniel, Sophie told me this is regular. On days when I'm not there. He said, Sophie is 8. She exaggerates. I said, Gerald's daughter does not exaggerate. Another silence. He said he would talk to Renee. He said he would handle it. He said, Mom, please, I know what I'm doing. I said, okay. I said it very quietly. Here is what I did not tell Daniel. Before I left the house that morning, I had taken out my phone and I had recorded. Not the bathroom, I had not thought of it in time, but I had recorded Renee in the hallway. Her tone, controlled but sharp, her choice of words about her rules and her house. And most importantly, I had recorded Sophie in the kitchen. Sophie's voice, Sophie's small, careful answers, Sophie's face when she checked the doorway to see if she was allowed to tell the truth. I sent the recording to my own email and my own voicemail, just to have it. Over the following 3 weeks, I watched carefully. I picked Sophie up every Tuesday, and I paid attention to details I had not thought to track before. The fading marks on Sophie's knees from kneeling on the tile. The way she held her hands sometimes, pressing the palms flat against her thighs. A small burn mark on her left forearm, just below the elbow, she told me the oven. That she had been taking something out and she had been careless. I asked who had been with her. She said she was alone in the kitchen. She was 8 years old. I contacted a family attorney. I presented everything I had, and I asked what options existed. The attorney told me that without more documentation, and given that Daniel was Sophie's legal father and had not expressed concerns, my ability to intervene directly was limited. She told me that Child Protective Services could conduct an investigation if I filed a report, but that the outcome would depend on what investigators found. She also told me something I had already begun to understand on my own, that what I had witnessed might not yet meet the legal threshold for removal, but that it was a pattern, and patterns tended to escalate. I filed a report with CPS. I submitted my recording. I told them about Sophie's knees, the burn mark, the bleach, the pajamas on the tile floor. I also called my bank. I want to be very clear about something, because I know this is where people's reactions diverge. The building on Linwood Avenue was mine. Gerald had bought it in 1998, and when he died, it passed to me, fully and legally. I had placed Daniel's name on the lease 6 years ago, but the property had never been transferred to him. The small business loan that I had co-signed was still active. Daniel had been making payments, but 14 months remained on the note. I was not punishing my son financially on impulse or in anger. I was making a calculation that I had spent 3 weeks thinking through very carefully. As long as Daniel was comfortable, as long as Ember was thriving, as long as the money flowed easily, as long as his life required nothing from him, he would not act. He had told me he would handle it. He had not handled it. And every week that nothing changed was another week that my granddaughter spent on her knees on a tile floor before I arrived on Tuesdays to take her somewhere she could breathe. I called Daniel and I told him what I was going to do. I gave him 48 hours to respond, to call me back with a concrete plan. Removal of Sophie from that home. A separation from Renee. Family court filings. Something. I said I was not asking him to divorce his wife over one conversation. I was asking him to protect his daughter. Those were not the same thing, and he needed to understand the difference. He called back in 4 hours. He was not calm. He said I was blackmailing him. He said I was using money to control his family. He said Renee was in tears and that I had no idea the damage I was doing. He said he had spoken to Renee and she had explained her side and he believed her. I said, then I'm sorry, Daniel. I have to do this. I notified the bank that I was withdrawing my co-signature from the small business loan, which triggered an immediate review of the note. The loan terms which Daniel had signed and which I had co-signed included a clause that required lender approval if the guarantor withdrew. The bank had the right to call the loan. Given that Daniel's business had had 2 difficult quarters and his individual credit was still thin, they called it. I also formally ended the lease agreement on the Linwood Avenue building with the 60-day notice required by the contract Daniel and I had signed 6 years earlier. The building was mine. The lease was mine to terminate. What happened next was not something I had fully anticipated, and I want to be honest about that. Daniel did not call me. Renee called me, actually screaming that I was a vindictive old woman, that I had always hated her, that I was going to destroy everything Daniel had built, that she would make sure I never saw Sophie again, that she had lawyers and I would regret this. I said, "Renee, I already filed a report with Child Protective Services 3 weeks ago. They have my recording. Whatever you're planning to do, it's a little late." She hung up. The CPS investigation lasted 11 days. They spoke to Sophie's teacher, who reported that Sophie had come to school twice with what appeared to be chapped or irritated hands, and that Sophie had, on one occasion, fallen asleep in the afternoon, and when the teacher woke her, Sophie had said she hadn't slept well because she'd had to finish the floors. The teacher had meant to file a report and had not. She filed one now. They spoke to Sophie's pediatrician, who noted in her records a pattern of minor injuries over the previous 14 months that had each been explained individually and plausibly, but that, taken together, formed a different picture. They spoke to Sophie. I don't know exactly what Sophie said. I was not in the room, but I know my granddaughter, and I know that when she understands she is safe, she tells the truth plainly, without drama, without exaggeration, in the careful, clear voice she uses when something matters. Renee was charged with child endangerment and willful neglect. The DA's office took the case seriously. There was documentation, witnesses, a recording, a pediatric record, and a school teacher's corroboration. Renee's attorney argued that it was a matter of parenting philosophy and that the grandmother had a personal grievance. The court disagreed. Renee was convicted. She was sentenced to 4 years in a state correctional facility, with parole eligibility after 2.5. Connor went to live with his biological father, which turned out to be a stable arrangement his father's family had been seeking for some time. Daniel. I need to tell you about Daniel separately, because this is the part that does not resolve cleanly, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The financial consequences were severe. Ember closed. He lost the building, lost the loan, lost the restaurant he had spent 6 years building. He moved into an apartment. For 4 months, he did not speak to me. I called every 2 weeks and left messages that said only, "I love you. I'm here when you're ready." He called on a Sunday morning, my old Ember morning, the Sunday I used to spend at the corner table with the roasted chicken, and he was crying before he finished saying my name. He said he hadn't known. He said that wasn't enough. He knew that. But he needed me to know that he genuinely had not understood how bad it was. He said Renee had managed his perception of Sophie the way she managed everything else in the household, and that he had let her because it was easier than seeing. I said, "I know." He said, "I lost my restaurant." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you regret it?" I thought about Sophie on the tile floor in her birthday pajamas. I thought about her palms. I thought about... She said, "I complain too much, and that's why Daddy is always tired." I thought about a little girl who had learned to check the doorway before she told the truth. I said, "No." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Can I see Sophie?" The family court had granted me temporary guardianship during the investigation and trial period. Sophie was living with me. She had been living with me for 7 months. She had a bedroom that she had helped me paint a color she called the inside of a peach. She had a dog now, a small beagle named Biscuit, that she had named herself and that slept at the foot of her bed every night and that she told her secrets to, in a whisper I pretended not to hear. I said, "Yes, you can see Sophie. But Daniel, she needs consistency. She needs to know that when you say you'll show up, you show up. She has had enough of the other kind." He said, "I know. He has been showing up every Saturday. He takes her to the park, or the movies, or just to a diner for pancakes. He calls her on school nights to help with her math homework, which she dislikes. He is learning how to be her father in a way he was not before. I am watching carefully. I am not finished watching. Sophie started 3rd grade in September. Her teacher sent home a note in October that said Sophie was one of the most engaged students in the class, that she had volunteered to help a new student who didn't speak much English yet, and that she had a gift for making people feel welcome. I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the small cedar box where I keep things that matter. Last Tuesday, we were in the kitchen making dinner together. Sophie has decided she wants to learn to cook, which I find completely wonderful and not at all surprising. And she was standing at the counter very seriously, chopping carrots, which I had shown her how to do safely, and she stopped and looked at me and said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I said, "You can always ask me anything." She said, "Did you close Daddy's restaurant because of me?" I thought about how to answer honestly to an 8-year-old. I said, "I closed it because I needed your daddy to understand that you were the most important thing. And sometimes people don't understand that until the other things go away." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her carrots. Then she said, "Is Daddy sad about it?" I said, "Yes, but he's working on something new. And he has you on Saturdays. I think that helps." She thought about this. She nodded. Then she went back to her carrots, very focused, very careful, the tip of her tongue visible between her teeth, the way it gets when she's concentrating. After a moment, she said, "Grandma?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart?" She said, "I'm really glad I live here." I kept my eyes on the pot I was stirring. I did not want her to see me cry, because she would worry, and she had worried enough for one childhood. I said, "I'm really glad too. There is a letter I received last month from Renee, written from the correctional facility. It was 2 pages long. The first page was mostly about what she had lost, and how unfair the system was, and how she had never intended any harm, and how people like me with money and influence could destroy a family without consequences. The second page was different. The second page was quieter. She wrote that she had started seeing a counselor at the facility, and that she had been asked to think about her childhood, and that some things she had started to understand about herself were uncomfortable. She wrote that she did not expect me to respond. She wrote, "I don't know if Sophie will ever understand, but I want her to know that she deserved better. She always did. I just didn't know how to give it." I read that page several times too. I have not responded. I don't know yet whether I will. Some things need more time before you know what the right thing is. What I know is this. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years watching people face the worst moments of their lives. And I learned that there are 2 kinds of hard choices: the ones you make because you don't see another way, and the ones you make because you see every way and you choose the hardest one on purpose because it's the only one that's true. I made the second kind. I knew what it would cost. I chose it anyway. Sophie is 8 years old. She has her great-grandfather's nose and her father's laugh, and something that is entirely her own, a particular kind of steadiness, a way of looking at the world directly, without flinching. She is going to be okay. She is already okay. And some Tuesday mornings, when the light is coming through the kitchen window and Biscuit is asleep in a patch of sun on the floor, and Sophie is telling me very seriously about something that happened at school, her small hands moving as she talks in those moments, I think about Gerald standing at the stove on that Saturday morning, and I think, I hope wherever you are, you can see this. I hope you know. It's enough. It really is enough.